You're listening to Precinct 444, a podcast network from the National Law Enforcement Museum. Today we're bringing you an episode from Law and Disorder, where we dive into the world of true crime stories with memorable cases that have lasting effects for law enforcement. Hello, and welcome to the first episode of Law and Disorder of 2024. Today's episode is a little bit different than other Law and Disorder episodes that we have released in the past. Today, the host of Law and Disorder, Anna Muckenfuss, is sitting down with Lori-Suzanne Dell, the author of A Fallen Star, The Murder of Ebenezer Parker and Execution of Joseph Drew, and Sheriff Kevin Joyce of the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office in Maine. In today's very special episode, they will discuss the life and death of Ebenezer Parker, who is regarded as the first ever line-of-duty death in New England, and the trial of his killers, which is the subject of Lori-Suzanne Dell's book. In this interview, Anna, Lori, and Sheriff Joyce will discuss Lori's book and the ways in which the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department is working to pay homage to the first ever fallen officer. Without further ado, we at Precinct 444 present a conversation about A Fallen Star.
Before we get into the story of Ebenezer Parker and his kind of history and career, let's go to the beginning of how this book that we're here to talk about came to be. So what initiated the search for Ebenezer Parker's grave and the renewed interest for his story over 2 centuries after his death?
So we received a memo from the Maine Criminal Justice Academy and the Maine Chiefs of Police, along with some medallions, informing us that they were for the officers killed in the line of duty. Now, I've been with the agency for 14 years, and I'm embarrassed to say that I'd never really realized that we had 2 officers killed in the line of duty, or 2 deputies. So, I got the names and I went to the website and tried to search on the internet these individuals. Well, the first individual, who was killed in 1941, or actually the last one that was killed in the line of duty, thankfully, was easy to find. In fact, he came from my hometown, and I was able to find where he was buried, and that was a pretty easy task. Then I started working on Ebenezer Parker, who was killed in the 1800s, and that became a bit of a challenge. And frankly, I used the internet. I went to a sheriff's conference out in Utah, and went to Park City, to the Mormons, and tried to do some history there. Ran into roadblocks, checked with our historical society. So from about 2002 on to about 2010, I was working pretty diligently trying to locate where Ebenezer Parker was buried. And quite frankly, I wasn't getting too far.
So you obviously brought in some reinforcements to help you with this search, and it led you to actually working on this project to really document his story and give his story that kind of moment that was lost in time. And you brought in Lori to help us do that. So how did the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office come to connect with Lori on this project?
Actually, she sought us out, quite frankly. It was 2017, 2018 when I received an email from Lori, and I read it, and she was interested in this Ebenezer Parker case, and obviously introduced herself, gave a brief history of herself, and asked if she could help me. And once I became sheriff in 2010, my time that I could spend for this was somewhat limited. So the case had really sat dormant for about 7 or 8 years. So I met with Lori. I had a couple of big notebooks, photocopies, et cetera, and we made a copy for her and basically sent her on her way. And that's when she took off starting to investigate this case.
And before we get into the story of Ebenezer Parker, Lori, tell us a little bit about yourself and what drew you to this project.
Well, I'm a historian. I'm basically a historian and a writer. I'm basically interested in the antebellum period of American history, which in the antebellum basically as 1820, from March 15th of 1820 until April 12th of 1861, the day that the Civil War begins. So going back in time to 1808 is something, a period of time that I'm very familiar with.
Mhm.
And I knew that the Parker investigation that the sheriff was involved in, trying to find out who he was going to take somebody who was very, very familiar with that period of time. And that's a period of time I've spent a lot of my life studying the politics of it, the government, America coming into being, England when they were here, religion, every aspect of the world back then, and what brought about the American Civil War. So I really had a very good idea of the time. I've written about it quite a bit for newspapers. I wrote a book called The Quill and the Bayonet, From Uncle Tom's Cabin to Appomattox Courthouse, which is a book about the Civil War, um, and what led to the war. Um, and so it was really my wheelhouse and my interest, was for the era of Parker. And I've not had any real experience in law enforcement or anything. I was not looking to start an investigation. I called this a historian's inquiry. I used Sheriff Joyce's name quite a bit throughout this, and I didn't want people to confuse me with being a deputy. So we kept that. I tried to keep that separate. So I just thought that this was, something that was in my wheelhouse and something that I could really lend my expertise on.
Absolutely. And we will ask you a little bit about what life was like in Parker's time, but let's actually introduce our listeners to Ebenezer Parker at this point. So, before he became the first law enforcement line of duty death in the state of Maine, what would become the state of Maine and essentially New England, he was many things. So, he was a son and a father, he was a veteran of the Revolutionary War, and ultimately he became a sheriff's deputy. So, could you give us a little bit of Ebenezer Parker's life up to his career in law enforcement?
Well, Ebenezer was, I think that he was a young man of dream and aspiration, like many young men. He sought out adventure. He and his brother John, Ebenezer was born in 1760. His brother John was born in 1758, 2 years before him. And when the revolution came about, all men really of, able body and years were needed. And this it was a period of time where the Parker men were all on a farm in Gorham and trying to get a farm going. Um, and they had only been on the farm a few years since moving from Cape Elizabeth. And now the revolution comes about, and John and Ebenezer both signed up with a local militia there in Gorham, and they went right away to coastal defenses at Cape Elizabeth and served there. And I believe, Ebenezer at this point is 15 years old. His brother John is 17 years old. And now they are in place for their first moment in history, which is when the British sail in October 18th, 1775. They sail into Portland Harbor and bomb the city of Portland in revenge for having arrested their ship's captain, Captain Henry Moat, a few months earlier. And so they're there and they witness the fleet sail in that night, probably take some pot shots at the ships, but the ships would have been too far away for the muskets to reach them. And then they stood there and witnessed the bombing, which went on from 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. that evening. And after the fleet sailed away, there's lots of evidence that says that they had all gotten on the ferry and taken the ferry across Portland Harbor, and then gone in and rendered aid in the city, what would become the city of Portland, as it was burning. So this is their first introduction to a real adventure. And by the way, the ferry that they crossed over on was owned by the Parker family, by Ebenezer's grandfather, Joseph Parker. So so this begins, their time. Brother John ends up leaving and going off. He ends up serving with his father at Valley Forge. Ebenezer stays behind with the coastal defenses, which was called the Seacoast Defenses at Cape Elizabeth, because they had 7 sisters, and the youngest boy had to stay home and watch over the women in the family at the same time that he was trying to defend. So he actually becomes one of the first of, I guess, what you would call the National Guard, who fought or protected, the coastal defenses of what would become Maine. At the time, it was called the District of Maine, which was a part of Massachusetts until March 15th of 1820. After the Revolution, there appears to be evidence that John and Ebenezer go off on sailing vessels, and they sail the 7 seas, which may have been a Parker-owned ship that would have been sailed, we believe, by their cousin or their uncle, also named Ebenezer Parker, who was a sea captain. And in 1887, Brother John dies at sea and is lost or buried somewhere off the coast of England. And by 1791, there's evidence that Ebenezer and his uncle Ebenezer are both back home, and they've given up the sea. And Ebenezer has all these sisters that he has to get married off, which he does. He gives permission, and he arranges land purchases and sales and all sorts of different things to help the dowries of his sisters, and he finally gets them all married. And then he helps his widowed mother to remarry. And then he finally meets a woman named Mary Larrabee, and they get married in Cape Elizabeth, and he settles down in Cape Elizabeth. And it's some time, and we're not sure when, but at some part in here, at some point between the time he came home and the time he got married, he took a job with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office.
So he becomes deputy sheriff in Cumberland County. That's kind of what really starts the meat of this story, especially when it comes to our memorial outside, and why we're here on the podcast. So he's a deputy sheriff. We still have deputy sheriffs today, but they're a little bit different, I can only assume. So what were the typical roles of a deputy sheriff in Ebenezer Parker's time? What would he have been doing in that role?
From what I'm able to understand from conversations with Sheriff Joyce, and from what I've read and what I've talked to other historians who are more of a law enforcement type historian, not much different than the job of a sheriff's deputy today. They had a lot to do with the court system, serving papers, taking care of prisoners, taking care of the jail, and handling matters of the county, and Cumberland County, I believe, came into being in 1760. And the sheriff at the time of Ebenezer's life, while he was a deputy, was named Colonel John Waite, and Colonel Waite was a veteran of the Revolution. And it's possible that Ebenezer knew him from serving under him at some point in time. And there seems to be evidence that Sheriff Waite hired a lot of people that he had served with. So he had a fairly good-sized department. and I've been able to recoup a lot of names of deputies through newspaper ads and different things. They handled auctions of property that was ordered to be sold by the court, things like that. And at the time, if you were in debt, actually was a crime to be indebted to someone and not pay your debts, because at the time, the United States was still a young country,
Mhm.
and we were still forming the laws, and Congress was still working out the laws that would eventually govern the United States and replace the old laws that were established under the rule of Great Britain. By the time that Deputy Parker becomes a deputy, they are still operating under much of the rules that were established under British law.
And one of those debts, or a person who had a debt and was, in essence, breaking the law in that way, is the reason why we find ourselves here talking about Ebenezer Parker's story today. His name was Levi Quinby. Would you like to tell us a little bit about how Levi Quinby and Ebenezer Parker would be connected?
Well, Levi Quinby, and this is the funny thing. I've had a few conversations with Sheriff Joyce, and it seems to me that Deputy Parker didn't do anything any different than most of the deputies do today, 215 years later. But Levi Quinby owed a debt to a man named Josiah Gould, and Levi Quinby was not paying his debt. So Josiah Gould went to an attorney. The attorney wrote out a writ, and the writ basically at the time was a legal piece of paper that they then hand over to a deputy and or to the sheriff. The sheriff assigns it to a deputy. The deputy goes out to serve it, and he gives the person, the debtor, period of time to come up with the money or go to jail. And Deputy Parker gave Levi Quinby 2 weeks to settle his debts. Levi Quinby still had not, and so another writ was given to Deputy Parker. Either it was another writ, actually, or he was told to go back and enforce the original. I'm not sure which. Either way, there's possibility that Deputy Parker had sent a message to Levi Quinby saying, you need to go pay this debt or I have to come get you. And then he waited. And on the day that he was told, that's enough, go get him, the first time he went and gave him 2 weeks, he actually left the funeral and arrested Levi Quinby. Levi, he had to then place in the custody of another gentleman who may have been a deputy with the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office, named Richard King, who is the brother of Cyrus King and William King, who became the first governor of Maine. Cyrus, of course, signed and helped to write the Constitution of the United States. So Deputy Parker leaves Levi Quinby with him to rush back to his aunt's funeral. And then when he came back to pick up Levi Quinby, Levi was gone. So Levi was on the run and had escaped. So he gave him time to settle the debt. And when he went and realized I have to go get him, I have to bring him in now, that brought us to the fateful day.
Yes, absolutely. And there's another character that's kind of involved in this interaction as well. So it's not only Levi Quinby who Ebenezer Parker encounters on that day. There's also a man named Joseph Drew. Can you tell us a bit about his role in all of this?
Well, Joseph Drew becomes the worst of the whole situation. Joseph Drew is a blacksmith who is working for a man named Daniel Conant. Daniel Conant owns the blacksmith shop in Westbrook. The town at the time was called Sacarapa. Today it's called Westbrook. And Levi Quinby was also a laborer in the blacksmith shop along with Drew, and the two knew each other. And Joseph Drew is he's a bad character. He's someone who likes to fight. He's someone who likes to drink. He likes to carouse. He likes to go out and hang out in the old port of Portland at the bars down there, which even to this day is a very, very active bar scene and has its share of trouble. But back then, it was a very, very dangerous place. A lot of seamen, sailors hung out down there and liked to fight each other. A lot of prostitutes were there, lots of gambling, lots of fighting. And Joseph Drew, by his own admission, was one of those people who just adored fighting. And he had this belief that he was a man who liked to take up for the lesser individual. He considered himself kind of a hero, that he would pick up and fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves, which really wasn't true. He just liked to fight, and he justified it in his mind this way. And on that day, which was January 11th of 1808, Deputy Parker arrives in Sacarapa looking for Levi Quinby. And Levi Quinby has heard word that Deputy Parker is searching for him. So Levi is running through Westbrook, trying to hide anywhere that he can and stay from Deputy Parker. Levi Quinby has armed himself with a club that he's hidden under his jacket. And he's ducking in and out of buildings. He's ducking in and out of houses. He ends up going into a mill, and Deputy Parker is not far behind him. Deputy Parker goes into one end of the mill while Levi goes out the other end. They're that close, and this mill is basically right across the street from the blacksmith shop. And then Quinby comes back around the corner. He goes into the house of Daniel Conant, who owns the blacksmith shop. He grabs liquor, steals a bottle of rum, and then goes back out the back door and over to the blacksmith shop and goes inside to hide. And Parker follows him back around, and people are going, yes, he just went that way, and are helping Parker to find him. With Deputy Parker are, I believe, 3 other deputies. There may have been more, but I've only received the names of 3 that he has with him, because the threat was made public by Levi Quinby that he would not be taken alive and that he would fight Deputy Parker and kill him if he had the chance. So Deputy Parker brings backup with him and tracks Levi Quinby to the blacksmith shop. And Levi is inside hiding, and asks Joseph Drew to keep him hidden away from Deputy Parker. And Joseph Drew, agrees to do so. So when Parker knocks on the door asking for Levi Quinby to come out, it's Joseph Drew who answers the door.
This kind of incident at the blacksmith shop doesn't kill Ebenezer Parker immediately. He ends up being injured and very gravely injured and in a coma. But he was the subject of they tried to save his life. They used fairly revolutionary medical technology in an attempt to save him. Can you talk about that at all a little bit?
It's trephining. It's called trephining. And a trephine is when a surgeon bores a hole in the skull to relieve pressure. When Deputy Parker was struck in the head, he was struck twice, but only once was in the head. It left a wound that was 4 inches long. It was 3 inches wide, and it was 2 inches deep in his skull. So it fractured his skull, obviously, from what a doctor tells me, that would have definitely been a fracture of the skull that would have been very deep, and that the brain would have immediately swelled. A lot of blood would have pooled up underneath the skull, and that blood pooling up would have put pressure on the brain, which would have started to retard his life his abilities of staying alive. So a doctor bores that hole in order to let that blood out and relieve the pressure that's on the brain. And Dr. Nathaniel Coffin, who lived in Portland, his home and his office were in Portland, Maine, which was by wagon and horse, according to Reverend Caleb Bradley. He wrote that he had made it from Portland to Westbrook one time on a horse in about 50 minutes.
Oh, wow.
So about an hour to get from Dr. Coffin's house, which was on the far eastern side of Portland, to what was just about the far east, the far western side, I guess, of Sacarapa. So it's quite a distance back then. And he would have, Richard King was leading the horses, and he would have taken Parker in a wagon. So it would have been a very, very long ride to get him to Dr. Coffin. And Dr. Coffin was known as the preeminent surgeon in the area for doing trephining. So he was the specialist at this.
Excellent. I found that really interesting in the book. The that kind of antebellum era medicine is a very fascinating topic. So I was really glad to kind of read about that in the book too.
I was really glad when I found the story of it in a newspaper article that was written about 100 years after that, and it was the editor of that same newspaper today believes that it was one of his reporters who interviewed a Parker relative who had come back to Bridgeton, Maine for a visit. And they sat down and had a conversation about genealogy and who the Parkers used to be, and then they got into that story. And that person's the one who told them the story of that.
That's interesting, and it's really amazing that he was able to survive that. First of all, that injury, and then make it that long distance to get to treatment, and then he survived. How long did he survive after the actual incident?
He made it exactly a week. He made it from the date that it happened on January 11th. He made it until the 18th when he died. And obviously, I've had an EMS background, although I have not asked a physician this question or any doctors whatsoever. I could say that probably the chances are that the cold weather that they had in January 11th probably helped to keep Ebenezer alive until he was able to make it to Dr. Coffin's office, because it would have helped to retard the bleeding, and so that he didn't bleed out on the way. That's quite a ride without having any real aid, going on there. So
Especially if you think unpaved roads and in the back of probably laid out in the back of a wagon, like those are not ideal conditions to transport someone who's gravely injured.
No, and there's that we have hills that they would have had to have gone up, and it was probably very snowy. I know it was snowy, because the day before was a large fire in Portland. The day before this happened on January 10th, it was called the Haymarket Row Fire in Portland, which destroyed newspapers, which is why we don't see more about the story of Parker, is because all of the day before, this stuff happens, on the 17th of January, the day before he dies, it burns. So all the newspapers are gone, so we don't get to read. This is why we're not finding more evidence of it in the newspapers. But they had talked about how it snowed, so we know that I know when it snowed. So he's going over icy, snowy covered hills with a wagon, and he's probably really whipping those horses trying to get Ebenezer there. And is a very good possibility, and I haven't been able to confirm this yet, that Richard King was actually Ebenezer Parker's brother-in-law. Because Richard King's wife is a Larrabee and Ebenezer Parker's wife is a Larrabee, but I haven't been able to find the connection to the two sisters yet.
And to get back to Levi Quinby and Joseph Drew, obviously they are found responsible for the death of Ebenezer Parker. They're both put on trial, but their trials are a little bit different from one another. So can you talk about that a little bit?
After the assault had taken place, the deputies, after they loaded up Deputy Parker, they got help and they went in there and they took Joseph Drew. I mean, he said he wouldn't be taken, but he was. And they got Levi Quinby. And they sat in jail from January 11th until May 28th or May 26th, actually, when the trials began. And in the meantime, they had to, wait to see what is the charge going to be. And once Deputy Parker died, obviously this was now murder. But there was a big question in the court whether this was going to be the murder of a citizen or the murder of a deputy, and how they were going to go about doing this. And according to the Chief Justice Theophilus Parsons, in an interview that he gave about this case, and he gave a very detailed description of the case, of every argument that was made by the attorneys, everything that they had to consider in this trial. We're very, very lucky to have found this record, because it really straightened a lot of things out that have fallen to myth over 215 years, and changed the way that we understand the trials. And Joseph Drew, he was when he was tried first, and they had to decide, so do we try him and as a citizen or as a deputy in that murder? Which one did he murder? And they left that up to the jury to decide. So, and then the question became, was this with malice aforethought that he committed this murder? And everybody was trying to, he had quite a defense team, and they were arguing, no, this was a moment of passion. That's all this was. This was a moment of passion. And the jury had decided that when all was done, because he swung the axe handle, or not the axe handle, but the pitchfork handle twice, striking Deputy Parker in the back of the neck above the shoulders, causing him to fall. That was the act of passion. But when he brought it back up and struck him again, that was malice aforethought. And then the question became, now that we're going to have the separate trial for Levi Quinby as a accessory to murder, because during the event, Joseph Drew throws a sledgehammer. It bounces off of Richard King's chest, and Drew backs up, and Quinby had thrown the pitchfork handle out into through the doorway. It landed at right behind Drew's feet, and Drew reached back, picked it up, and that's what he bludgeoned Deputy Parker with. So, but then the question became, did he do that with the intention of helping Joseph Drew? And it went through several different questions, and somehow or another they came to the conclusion that Levi Quinby did not intend for that to be a murder weapon when he threw it out through the doorway, and he was found not guilty and released. So very strange.
Very, very strange and very.
But one of the things was, though, is that his lawyer, Quinby had a lawyer named Stephen Longfellow. Stephen is the father of Maine poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And working in Stephen Longfellow's office is Moses Quinby, who is the first cousin to Levi Quinby. So that's how he ended up with Stephen Longfellow being his attorney. So for that, and then of course Stephen Longfellow goes on to represent Joseph Drew in his appeal and fails.
Yes, and we've only touched on the story here. I definitely want to encourage the people that are listening to the podcast today to actually check out the book and read the rest of the story, because we don't want to give too much away here, but we want to give them a taste of what they will experience in the book. And you've written this, and even the way that you describe it here today, you describe it almost as if you were actually there. And it takes a lot of research from primary sources to be able to tell the story from that long ago in such a way. So I want to take the next few minutes, next few questions that I have, and just kind of talk about the type of research that you did to really build this story and be able to tell it in its entirety in the way that you have. The book's written based upon years of genealogical research and archival research of these primary sources from the time. You really dive deeply into Ebenezer Parker's family tree. So, can you describe kind of what that process of doing that genealogical research looks like?
This was the most complex historical research project I've ever worked on in my entire life. Um, I've lost brain cells with this, let me tell you. And I use this now. Like this year, I've been teaching. I teach at Mary Meeting Adult Education in Topsom, and I've been teaching genealogy courses this year, and using the Parker case as a teaching tool now as to how people can find unfindable evidence, because a lot of people tried to resolve this question of Deputy Parker for a long time and were not able to. I don't say that to brag. I say that to try to highlight the point that there are sometimes you have to go beyond what you just pull up in a search box on a computer, and you have to go back to the archives, and you have to walk down into that basement, and you have to pull off those dusty folders, and you have to blow them out and look for records. And so to do this took not only the genealogy portion, which let me get back to that in a moment, because the genealogy portion was very, very specific and for a specific purpose, which is the reason why I had contacted Sheriff Joyce. To find all of the documents was difficult because Maine at the time was a part of Massachusetts. Maine was not Maine. So a lot of the records on this might have been at one time held somewhere here in Maine, but if they were filed, say, after the trial was done, it was probably filed with Massachusetts because they were the, convening the governmental authority over the District of Maine at the time. So I had to research through Massachusetts. We had to research here in Maine. So the documents had been spread out through a lot of places, and it was very, very difficult. Many times I had to contact Sheriff Joyce and ask for his help in getting through to somebody somewhere who had, the ability to give me access to records, which we were, fortunately able to do. The genealogy part of this was more so to find the grave. It was not really to tell the story. And it did help to tell Deputy Parker's story, of course, knowing, how many sisters he had and whatnot. And it ends up actually proving point that we come to later on with some documents that come up that point me right into the cemetery. But I needed to go and find every single member of the Parker family. I had to find their graves. I have to know, where are they buried? And I need to know, do they all have headstones? Are their graves still findable? And I went to, here in Cumberland County, Androscoggin County. I went to Bridgeton. I went to Westbrook. I went to Gorham. I went to Durham. I'm in Freeport. I'm in Stand. I'm all over the place. And everybody in his family, I found their graves, and they all had headstones. And that brought me down to a list of certain members of the family who I could not find. No matter what I did, I could not find. Well, what did they have in common? They all lived in those years surrounding Ebenezer Parker. They all lived in Cape Elizabeth, and they were all his immediate family. So there's three things that really tell me that this cluster of people at this cluster of time are what's missing. And, so now I knew exactly who I'm looking for. So I've got more people to look for instead of just one, which makes it a little easier to do.
And you did end up coming up with a bit of like a short list of where you believed that the grave may be located. Can you tell us a little bit about what kind of investigations you did to attempt to confirm that those locations of those graves, and then the challenges that kind of arose as you were doing those investigations?
Well, I went to a number of graveyards. First of all, was to decide, well, what graveyards existed at the time of Ebenezer's death in 1808. If the cemetery didn't come into being until 1830, well, that's automatically eliminated. So we don't worry about that. If historians are telling me they stopped using this cemetery over here in 1777, well, then that one falls off the list. So, by process of elimination, that was the first step, was to narrow down, the number of cemeteries. And then we started going to the cemeteries. In the general area, I had started with historical theory has been a huge part of this entire inquiry all along. And historical theory is where it's like a bridge being washed out. You're driving down the road, and all of a sudden it's like, wow, there's no bridge here. How do I get to the other side of the road? Well, you build a bridge using historical theory, and then you cross that bridge, and that brings you back to the next part of the road that you can continue traveling on. If you go over that bridge of historical theory and that road is not there meeting you, then your historical theory is incorrect. If you can finally get over that bridge of historical theory that you've designed and that road is there to meet you, you know that your historical theory is probably correct. So using that, is it possible that he was buried in this cemetery? Oh, probably not likely, because, well, this one's been eliminated. But first I would actually go there and look. And one of those cemeteries, the Long Creek Cemetery in South Portland, was one of those cemeteries that I had to ask Sheriff Joyce to help me get access into, to look at, because it was behind the closed gates of the 133rd Air National Guard in South Portland. So, and this was at the time of COVID. So, not only are there heightened security measures, but COVID's in place and whatnot. And this Long Creek Cemetery is there and had to be looked at. And Sheriff Joyce was able to contact Lieutenant Colonel Brian Kammermeyer and get me permission. And Lieutenant Colonel Kammermeyer opened up their records that they had there on the base about the cemetery, which provided no information on our Parkers. And then he took me out for a tour of what was left of the cemetery. It was about 18 graves. And historian Leonard Bond Chapman had said back in about 1895 to 1905 in an article that that cemetery had hundreds of graves. So that told me, well, there's nothing I could do. There's no list of names. Chapman's telling me this was hundreds of graves. It's now down to 18. This one's off the list. Even if he's here, there's nothing I could do. So we just moved on, and kept eliminating graveyards. And then we came down to the Eastern Cemetery in Portland. And we had, there was really good reason to believe that he could be there. His sister Deborah, her husband, and two of her children were there. Sheriff Waite was buried there. Many of the lawyers who were involved in this case were buried there. The former jailer of Cumberland County was buried there. Many of the people who knew Ebenezer were buried there. And many of the jurors that had been in both trials of Ebenezer and Joseph Drew and of Quinby were also buried there. And this was right around the corner from the doctor's office and everything. And so that became a prime target. And when we were done examining that cemetery, it turned out he wasn't there. I then decided, well, I've got one more cemetery left, and that's in Cape Elizabeth. But I've never found anything that suggested he was buried there. Nothing, not a thing. And I'm like, I've already looked at this and eliminated it once, but I have this feeling and I have to go back and look at it again. And it was just about that time that I had been involved in a conversation with Mark Sweat at the Westbrook Historical Society, and I was helping him on another mystery of a missing woman from 1937. And I said, hey, Mark, do me a favor. Can you take a look around there and see if you've got anything on Ebenezer Parker? I said, I've asked before, but could you look again? And he did. And he goes, you know what? He says, yeah, I've got a folder sitting right here. And he sends this. It took him 2 weeks to scan everything that was in this folder and email it to me. And in there was what I referred to as the Stackpole pages, which was the first thing that leads me to the Mount Pleasant Cemetery in what is now South Portland. At the time of Ebenezer Parker's life, it was Cape Elizabeth. So that took me there. And then the genealogy comes back into it one more time, a couple more times, because my biggest question was, how does, in his 4 pages, Stackpole doesn't say how he knows that this Parker family is buried there. So I decided, well, I can't figure out how he knows this, but I have to know. So I did Stackpole's genealogy and found out his sister was married to Gardner Larrabee. Gardner Larrabee was the grandson of Ebenezer's sister. So he was family.
That's really interesting. And it always tends to be the last place you look, which is very, very interesting. But do you recall how you felt in that moment when you realized that it was most likely that he was at that Mount Pleasant Cemetery?
Oh, it was absolute disbelief. I can't forget how I felt, because I was pulling up and going through all of these scans in the computer. And all of a sudden I'm like, all right, I'll go look at the next one. And this was getting really tired, because at this point, every time I looked over somebody else's stuff, I was so involved in the research that I could look at something that somebody had, and by the time we got through the first sentence of it, I could go, nope, that's wrong. Nope, that's wrong. Nope, that's wrong. Nope, that's the other guy. That's the guy in Gorham. That's the guy. And I could just file right through stuff. And now all of a sudden comes these 4 pages that I had never seen. And I'm like, and I'm reading it and I'm like, yeah, Joseph Parker, his life, what are you leading up to? So you're telling me this story. And I'm looking at it and I'm going, boy, this reads like Everett Stackpole, whose history I am well aware of. I know his writing very well. And it didn't have his name on it. It was just these 4 pages that were written. And so as I go through it, I'm like, well, okay. And he gets done going through this long list of family and talking about who these Parkers were. And he's talking about Cape Elizabeth. And he says, so they lived here and they had this property here and they worked over here. And I'm like, yep, you're up on the hill. Yep, you're around that cemetery. Yep, I know. Okay. And then he says, and I have visited, the cemetery, twice visited the cemetery with the long Parker lot of, stones, small field stones not inscribed. And I almost lost my mind. I was like, that's what you were leading up to. Oh my God. He doesn't mention who's buried there. He can't, because the stones he describes as being small field stones not inscribed. So what he's seeing, I believed all along, was that the headstones had fallen, the grass had grown over it, and he's seeing the backside of the stones. This is what I had believed. And So that's all he's seeing. And of course, he's not seeing any writing. He's just seeing these stones and going, okay, so they're all sitting here. So, and I'm like, but how do you know this? How do you know these are the Parkers? So, and we got into it, but it was absolute elation. I reread, the whole line like 6 or 7 times. And I found it mind-blowing as we moved on how many people actually had those 4 pages in their hands who were looking for Deputy Parker's grave and didn't realize that what was written in these pages. So when I saw that, I was more elated that I recognized what I was reading and didn't lose, track or lose sight of it.
And so now that you think you've found the cemetery where he is, what's the next step? Next step between now and identifying that actual grave?
Well, I'd like to say that this is pretty much the end of my part in this. My job coming into this, I'm a historian, so was to find everything that I could find historically, to pull all the documents together, to pull all the information together, to pull theory together, and then hand it back to Sheriff Joyce, because first of all, this is his project. So any decisions that are to be made are really for him to decide. I just wanted to be to help and to give them information to act upon. So anything that goes on from this point, I'm pretty much just a spectator. And so the question, I think, is one that you'd have to put to Sheriff Joyce.
So I will put it to Sheriff Joyce. Lori has done all of this kind of historic background and led you kind of in that right direction. What do you think the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department is going to do next with all of this information, especially now that you feel like you have a place where we may have actually found this grave, or at least the cemetery where he is?
So in last December, we contacted one of my evidence techs, went to the National Forensic Academy down in Knoxville, Tennessee. He came to know an individual by the name of Peter Leach that works for Geophysical Survey Systems, Inc. in Nashville, New Hampshire. They do ground penetrating radar. So we actually went over the area that Lori identified as potentially being the lost Parker lot. And we recently, within the last month, got the results back. What we can say for that area that really is a grassy area, it's suspect because there's no headstones with the exception of a couple. There are artifacts under the ground that look like headstones. In fact, it also looks like at one point there was a pathway that went through there based on the ground penetrating radar. So, it's my intention to work with the Mount Pleasant Cemetery Board of Directors. I have to add that when I was doing the research, one thing I found out that was consistent was that Ebenezer grew up in what we call the Mill Creek area of South Portland, which at that time was Cape Elizabeth. And after all of this work by Lori, this Mount Pleasant Cemetery is in the Mill Creek area of South Portland. So it was kind of one of those where the answer was kind of right under our nose. It's just that we didn't know about it. So I do want to work with the Mount Pleasant Cemetery Board of Directors. I would like to honor Ebenezer. We honor the fallen today, rightly so, for what they've given, their sacrifice, their service. I don't think Ebenezer Parker in 1808 got that. I know he didn't get the honor that he deserved that we give today. He's a name on the memorial wall in Augusta, Maine, and obviously in Washington, D.C. But we have no place to go to mount this flag in May when we honor the fallen each year. So my hope is that we can somehow, without disturbing the area, potentially harvest what we think is the headstones, hopefully find some evidence, but I'm prepared that we won't ever be 100% sure. But hopefully we can find something that says that Ebenezer Parker's at peace, laying in rest in the Mount Pleasant Cemetery. If that's the case, then I've got some individuals in the community that are willing to do some fundraising so that we can put a monument there, so that people in the future will be able to go to a place and be reasonably certain that Ebenezer Parker is at rest in this area, and that we can honor his service and sacrifice in 1808, finally, in 2024.
Absolutely.
It's a long time coming.
Absolutely. It is a very long time coming, and a very, after a very valiant effort. And obviously, I was really hoping that you would have some results from the ground penetrating radar by the time that we met today. So I was happy those results came into you last month. And I have one final question for you, and you may have touched on it a little bit, but just so that we have it kind of here for our conclusion today, what does having this written record of such a historic officer of Ebenezer Parker, what does having that story on the written record, and now having that evidence of knowing where his grave is most likely to be, what does that mean to the present day Cumberland County Sheriff's Department and for the Cumberland County Sheriff's Department of the future?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have a lot of history. Nobody's taken the time. My predecessors have either, thrown history away, or it got lost. Maybe it was burned in the two fires that happened in Portland, Maine, between 1800s and today. This is huge. I mean, Lori's work was very important. You need to know where you were to know where you're going. Law enforcement is based on history and tradition. And unfortunately, our predecessors didn't look at it that way. When you walk around my office, you will find old badges and old instruments that were used for law enforcement, because to me, that's very important. So this book is huge. And it really takes that part of our history and fills in the blanks. But we've got a lot of other history that really is out there. And I hope that this is a start. I often said that before I retire, this is the ultimate cold case, that we honor Deputy Parker with a monument, because he was a pretty important guy for his time.
And I guess I should ask Lori one final question as well. If you could say anything to our listeners about why they should read this book, what would you leave them with?
I think I say it in the dedication. Our law enforcement officers really are the domestic guardians of our society, whereas our soldiers of the military protect us from the outside. Our society, our democracy is created and it's established and run by its laws. And law enforcement, they are the guardians of those laws. They enforce them, they protect us with them. And I think that it's very important that people have more of a respect for what law enforcement does on a daily basis. I don't think that people have that respect anymore. They used to, but I think that they're losing it. I don't believe that it's being taught the way it used to be, especially back when I was a child. And so I would hope that takes place. I would hope that people would realize that here was a life. Here was a man who lived, who served his country, who had a family, who had a responsibility to his family that he met. He had sisters, he had a mother, he had a brother, he had all of this family, and they all relied upon him. And this other individual took his life just for doing his job, for protecting an early America, an early Maine. Today, I think people don't think much of it. And over the years, the story of Deputy Parker and Joseph Drew has been bastardized. It's been mythologized. And I'm hoping that this book will straighten out that record, will put that myth finally to an end. There was an article that we came across that had been written 120 years, I think it was, after Joseph Drew's execution. And it was a romantic piece written in a newspaper in Westbrook about Joseph Drew being buried in the Sacarapa Cemetery, and a little girl who had always been in love with him, who was delivering flowers to his grave. I mean, it was this ridiculous story. He's not even buried there. And it was just absolute ridiculousness. And a lot of these stories came out about Joseph Drew, and he was mythologized, whereas Deputy Parker was bastardized. And so I'm glad if my book can finally put that myth to rest and reverse it and tell who was the good guy and who the bad guy really was in this story.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today about the book, A Fallen Star, which is available now. Thank you both so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us for this very special episode of Law and Disorder. Check out Lori-Suzanne Dell's book, A Fallen Star, The Murder of Ebenezer Parker and Execution of Joseph Drew. We hope to bring you more interviews like this in the future. In the meantime, remember that the schedule of Precinct 444 is changing slightly. Episodes will now be released every other Wednesday with a new Law and Disorder episode on the last Wednesday of every month. And as always, if you find yourself in Washington, D.C., come visit us at 444 East Street Northwest, right off of the Red Line at Judiciary Square. Please subscribe to Precinct 444 on your favorite podcasting platform to stay connected and to receive our latest content as soon as it drops. We would love to hear from you. Send in your questions, comments, and feedback to precinct444@nleomf.org. You can help us make our content even better. The National Law Enforcement Museum is located at 444 East Street Northwest in Washington, D.C., and is dedicated to telling the story of American law enforcement. We expand and enrich the relationship between law enforcement and the community through educational journeys, immersive exhibitions, and insightful programs. Find us online at lawenforcementmuseum.org and stay tuned for more podcast content from Precinct 444. Until next time, stay safe. We'll see you at the precinct.